How's it going? Today we're going to be discussing dueling. Now, dueling is a very misunderstood piece of our history here in the Western world, but it's very important, and it's unfortunate that many people don't understand why dueling took place. It's often pushed off as a bloody, barbaric competition between two people, but that's because people who say those kinds of things don't really understand why dueling took place in the historic context. So I'm going to be going through some of the misconceptions about dueling and some of the tools used, firearms and whatnot, and some of the rules. So maybe we can clear up some misunderstandings and really get a good understanding of why duels happened. That's the most important thing, because it was not just a bloody competition. There was actually a reason that two people got onto a field, pointed guns at each other, and put their lives on the line. So I just wanted to clear up some of the misconceptions, starting with the tools used. So the first firearm we're going to take a look at is, of course, the dueling pistol. Now, this is a good stand-in for a dueling pistol. Unfortunately, I haven't had the time to make a dedicated dueling pistol, but this fits all the qualifications. This is actually a heavy dragoon. What it is a large caliber smoothbore flintlock, and this fits the bill for a dueling pistol. Now, the reason they use smoothbore is because of its inherent inaccuracy. There was a chance that even if you're aiming at the other person that you are going to miss. It added a bit of uncertainty to it, and it added a bit of, I call it, sportsmanship. That's not to say they didn't have guns that were far more accurate than this, but they chose to use these normally because the intention was not to kill your opponent. Your intention was, in fact, to restore your honor or uphold your honor. It was not just to kill the other person, generally. Now, there are some caveats to this, but in general, this is the pistol you would use. Now, the type of pistol you used was quite important, and more or less the quality of the pistol. How good your trigger was, how quality the parts were, and all that could really make more of a difference than you think, and maybe not in the way you think. So if you had an extremely good quality pistol with a hair trigger, everything was absolutely perfect on it, when you were staring down at the other person, you would be staring at exactly the same pistol, because you would be using, generally, a cased set of pistols. If you were challenged to a duel, you had the choice of picking the pistols. So if you had an extremely good quality set of pistols, it could be a deterrent to challenging you to a duel, because they know that you have one was with a hair trigger or whatnot. But on the flip side of that, if you were going to choose those pistols for the duel, not only are you going to have a higher chance of killing them when you're aiming at them with your best set of pistols, they're going to have a better chance of killing you. So there was some fairness in it. But thinking about what kind of pistol you wanted to buy or have made for you could have serious ramifications in whether you live or die, or who's going to challenge you. Now, as you can see, I've hit this target a grand total of 3 times out of 5 shots. Now, what you've got to remember is that the average human body is probably going to be about that wide when they're in a dueling shooting stance. They're standing sideways, basically. So really, that outside shot there may have not even struck them. And I'm a pretty good shot. My job involves me qualifying with a pistol a couple times a year. But that's the best I can do at about 15 paces with a smoothbore pistol. Now, as I said in that little clip there, the shooting stance makes it rather hard to hit somebody, because you would turn your body sideways when you're shooting. Now, this was to give them a smaller target, but on the flip side of that, any hunters would know that shooting at this part of your body, there's a higher chance you're not going to hit an organ that's going to kill them right away. It's not going to be a kill shot. However, if you turn sideways, the bullet's going to pass straight through your chest cavity and definitely hit some organs. You'll know if you're a hunter that you aim right behind the shoulder. So although you gave them a smaller target, you're also increasing the chance you're going to die if you got hit. Now, one of the misconceptions, mainly due to people just don't know a lot about flintlock firearms or firearms for that era, is that they didn't have rifled pistols at the time, or they didn't have accurate pistols, which is untrue. They actually did. They deliberately chose to use smoothbores because it made it less likely that they were going to die. It added some randomness, as I said. This is a rifled flintlock. In fact, it has sights. If you notice on my heavy Dragoon pistol I was using, there were no sights. And on a dueling pistol, there would not be any sights either. It added a little bit more challenge to it, and a little bit more, not fairness, but it made the duel less likely to be lethal. This gun, on the other hand, if you were to duel with this, it would almost certainly be lethal. Now, that's not to say that they didn't use rifled pistols. In fact, they did. But as I said before, it was up to the one challenged as to what weapons would be used. It was often historically said that if you chose a rifled pistol, it demonstrated that you were uncertain about your accuracy. You see over and over again it repeated that rifles were really discouraged. Rifled bores were really discouraged because they basically meant that the fight was going to be lethal. Now, I'll show you why here in just a second. Now, my target pistol, my rifled target pistol, as you can see, has a very nice group all inside the kill zone, fired from about the same distance as the smoothbore pistol. These are all kill shots, or at least wounding shots to the point where you would win the duel. Now, as you can see, that the chance that someone's going to die is greatly increased by using rifled barrels. As I said, they were used historically, but it was generally in a competition where somebody wanted to kill the other person. It adds a whole nother level to the duel. It made it almost certainly lethal. And you do see competitions where the two going against each other really wanted to kill each other, and that happened. But you also see competitions where, especially later on, when it went away, the rules went away from allowing the challenge to pick to allowing the seconds to pick. And sometimes the seconds had their own agendas, and they would choose to use rifled bores for one reason or another, and the duel would almost certainly be lethal, as I showed before. Now, dueling went all the way up to the Civil War, and actually past the Civil War in some countries such as Germany. And as you may know, revolvers were coming on the scene well before the Civil War. This is a Colt 1851. Now, revolvers were used in some very limited numbers in duels. The problem is that if you didn't get a lot of range in your duel, you were in trouble. Now, as I said, the challenge gets to pick the weapon used. However, the one challenging generally gets to pick the range used, depending on the rules. Later on, it would have been the seconds choosing. But generally, it would have been the one who's doing the challenging. So if I say, okay, we're using revolvers to maybe try to step it up to get you to apologize instead of continuing the duel, you could say, well, okay, well, we're doing it at 50 yards then. But a lot of the times when revolvers were used, it was almost certainly lethal. This pistol, this revolver, is almost identical to a modern firearm. In fact, there's very few things that are different other than in the cylinders, and these are as accurate and generally as powerful as modern firearms. And putting that in the context of a duel, it meant that someone was almost certainly going to die. Now, as I said, the most common firearm in any duel was the dueling pistol, the smoothbore pistol. However, there are some outliers that were used more or less very uncommonly, but they do crop up. The first one you're probably going to hear about is shotguns. Now, in this context, it's not the modern shotgun. Generally, when I talk about this, their first image is a modern shotgun. But what's really being used is a double-barrel musket. They're not using shot in these. These are muzzle-loading firearms, much like this flintlock here, although they were probably percussion, and they're loaded with balls. They're basically side-by-side muskets. And generally, these were used at greater ranges. The one duel I'm thinking of was actually done at 40 paces, so about 40 yards. And there was actually 4 rounds that these duelists went through. The first one, I think one fired off both barrels at the same time, the other one fired off one after the other, and they went through 4 rounds of this before they actually had a winner. I believe the gentleman was killed. But this was very uncommon. I'm not exactly sure why they would choose this. More than likely that shotguns were the only thing they had at the time. They didn't have dedicated dueling pistols, and that's just what they chose to use. This was very uncommon, but it did happen historically. Now, this form of dueling requires a bit of explanation because the weapons used are unconventional and the rules are quite unconventional. Now, this is very rare historically. However, it did occur, so I feel the need to mention it. Now, these duels were carried out with rifles. This is a flintlock rifle, specifically a Pennsylvania long rifle. And that would be generally what they'd be using in America, which is the only place I have ever heard of this type of duel happening. Now, what would happen is the 2 opponents would pick a distance, probably pretty far away, because this rifle is deadly accurate up to 100 yards. If you're aiming at a man-sized target at 100 yards, you stand a very good chance of hitting them. They would stand, generally I've heard about 40 paces apart, so about 40 yards. And when the signal was given to go, they would not be aiming to fire. What they'd be doing is loading. So it was really a race to load, because once you loaded, you stood a very good chance of killing your target. Now, I'm going to demonstrate what you would do. Now, unfortunately, it's not recorded how they were set up. So I'm going to show you how I would do it if someone told me I'm in a duel to the death and I have to load my gun faster than the other guy. So this is a bit of my own interpretation, but this is how I would do it. Oh. Way too much powder. And hopefully I won. Now, although my channel deals almost exclusively with firearms, there were, of course, blades used, both swords and knives. However, I want to put in a little caveat about the knives here in a second. But swords were actually used all the way up through the Civil War. In Europe, they were extremely popular, especially in France. Germany, they tended to go with pistols more. But in America, they did survive all the way almost to the American Civil War, especially in Louisiana. This could be because of the French influence there, but Louisiana had very long tradition of sword fighting, and it survived there for much longer than the rest of the country. Also in the Carolinas, they had a lot of, apparently they sent a lot of their kids over to France to study, not sword fighting, but study at the colleges there. And they came back reportedly with rapier fencing, which I don't know a ton about swords, but it seems very odd that they would be rapier fencing in the Carolinas at that time period. I'm not 100% positive if by rapier they actually mean the modern term that we put to rapier, or if they actually mean a stabbing sword, like maybe a spadroon or something like that. I don't actually know if the term rapier applies to the sword we consider a rapier nowadays. But it's worth mentioning because it was an important part of dueling, and of course it predated firearms. However, the area of discussion I'm talking about is the dueling pistol era. Now, one thing I wanted to mention is loading of these pistols. Now, the seconds would load the pistols, not the actual duelist, and the reason for this was that they could check each other's pistols and make sure that they were loaded properly. Now, they were allowed to check, as I said, the loading, if they were properly loaded and everything, but this was generally not done, depending on where you were at in the world, different nations, because it was considered kind of rude. They're supposed to be gentlemen, so their word was supposed to be good. In fact, if you were to check someone else's pistol, insinuating that they were cheating, you could be challenged to a duel yourself. Now, the reason I bring this up is because there is an infuriating lack of information about how these pistols were loaded. But I have a theory. Now, please, this is my opinion, this is not historical, but I have read a lot of accounts of duels, and this is what I've gained from it. This pistol, like this Dragoon here, was used in duels. However, the military load for these was a massive amount of powder, up to like 60 grains of powder behind this 54 caliber, just an insane amount of powder historically. We would not load that much today target shooting, and I do not believe they loaded that much when they were dueling. From the information we're given about these duels, wounds and different things, it seems that they were loading a much smaller amount of powder most of the time. Now, as I said, they used all different types of weapons for dueling. They had all different types of motivations for trying to kill each other or not kill each other. But generally, it seems they loaded these pistols so that they were slightly less lethal. Probably for the same reason they opted to use smoothbores without sights most of the time. Similarly, they probably loaded these down to a much lesser charge than they generally would. Now, in accounts where military people are facing off against each other, it often seems that they were using full charge, and what you'll hear in these records is they shot the man through and through. And what that meant in old-timey speak, or historical speak, is it went straight through him. It went in one side and through the other. And that is exactly what would happen if I loaded this heavy Dragoon up with a full charge of shot and blasted someone in the chest. It would shoot right through them like they were warm butter. But that's not what we see happen in these duels. What we see happen in these duels is often the ball gets stuck in somebody. It's not a lethal shot. There are reports of balls being stopped by a pocket watch. Now, I assure you, this is not because black powder guns are weak. That is, in fact, not the case. If this was to hit a pocket watch, it would blast through it like it was nothing. It would, in fact, probably carry the pocket watch into you. However, if I was to load this up with a very small charge, it is entirely possible that it would be stopped by a pocket watch. Now, there are also reports of it being stopped by a knife that he was carrying, that the person being shot was carrying, and many different other things. And it just seems to me that these were not loaded up with a full charge. But that is my opinion. That's what it seems. But what this does is adds to our understanding of what these duels were for. They were not meant to kill the other person. It was a challenge. It was to defend your honor. It was not meant to kill each other. For the same reason that they used smoothbores without sights, as I said, is probably the same reason that they did not use a full charge of powder. Now, as I've shown, there are a number of different ways a duel could be carried out. Now, there were written rules for dueling, and this varied from country to country, from region to region. In the United States alone, there was a number of different dueling traditions. Louisiana had its own dueling tradition. South Carolina, or Carolinas, had their own traditions. Generally, it went with whatever nationality was in that area. Now, in America, we had a codified version of the Wilson Code in 1838, which changed some of the rules. One of the major ones was one that I mentioned before. If you were challenged, you didn't necessarily then pick the firearm or method for the duel. It would be your seconds. But there were a lot of different changes and variations. And even with that, the dueling codes were not law. They were at no point law. They were merely a suggestion, more of a social norm of how you would carry these out. Now, one misconception is that these were duels to the death. They were not, generally. Now, I say generally because duels were done for a number of different reasons, with many different motivations and many different end goals. Some really were meant to kill each other. So when speaking about lethality, it's very difficult to generalize every different duel because of that. But on the whole, duels were not meant to be lethal. In fact, sometimes the duelists wouldn't even fire at each other. Now, this was discouraged generally in the rules, but what would happen would be they'd both get on the fields, point at each other, then just fire in the air. And the meaning of this was that both contestants, or both duelists, went to the field to demonstrate their honor. They were willing to stand there, but they chose not to kill each other. Sometimes, even in extreme situations, you would be facing, or an opponent would be facing somebody, they'd see that their gun would jam, or the other person would actually fire and miss, and the other opponent would simply fire in the air because he didn't want to kill the other person, or he didn't feel it was fair at that point. So it wasn't always lethal. In fact, the rules say any wound that makes the hand shake, meaning you're seriously wounded, that would end the duel. Other dueling rules say any wound will end the duel. But generally it was not meant to go to lethal extents unless the participants chose that. And even then, their seconds were meant to prevent it. These were not barbaric competitions meant to end in someone dying, generally. They were meant to uphold honor. Now, the topic of honor is what this video is really meant to discuss, and it's the reason that people have a misconception about what a duel is for. Now, the biggest misconception is why people dueled. Now, what you have to understand is that people do not get in front of a firearm and willingly have someone shoot at them for no good reason. We often, when we say honor nowadays, we have a very lofty view of what honor means. Back in those days, they had a very down-to-earth, practical meaning of honor that we really don't understand these days. When I say honor in that context, what I really mean is credibility and social status, which meant everything in those days. They didn't have credit checks in those days. Really, whether or not your word was worth anything really meant everything to you. You could lose everything you have if you were deemed unhonorable. Because what that meant was that you were part of a lower social class, and people wouldn't do business with you. They wouldn't give you loans, they wouldn't uphold contracts. It could completely destroy your life, and it did. If you refused to take a challenge from somebody, if someone challenged you to a duel, and you refused, what would happen would, in America, and for the most part Europe, what would happen would be you would be posted. That's what it was called in America. It was called different things or done different ways in other countries, but in America you would be posted. And what this meant was literally posters would be put up of you telling that you were a coward, untrustworthy, a liar, and it would destroy you. It would destroy you with the social classes that you generally run in, and no one would do business with you. I know one example of someone who was posted, refused to take a duel, and he disappeared to his ranch, to his estate for 10 years and was not seen. Other people were forced to leave the state, basically get far enough away that people wouldn't know who they were. It would wreck you. Financially, socially, you were worth nothing. And this wasn't done for no reason. The purpose of a duel is to actually give you recourse if someone offends your honor. Now, as I said, honor wasn't just a lofty concept. If someone called you a liar and you did not take action against him to defend your honor, you could be seen as a liar. You could be seen as a dishonorable person, someone you shouldn't do business with. Or if your wife was insulted, you could be seen as a lowlife if you didn't stand up for her. This was not some lofty concept of whether or not you're honorable in some higher aspect. This is whether or not people want to do business with you, whether they want to associate with you, which meant that you couldn't have the right contacts to stay in business or be socially upwardly mobile, especially if you were a politician, if you were not seen as honorable. So you had to defend your honor, and this gave you a recourse to do it. Now today we have libel courts. You can go and sue somebody for libel. That did not exist back in the day. The only way you could really take care of this is to take care of it on your own and challenge someone else. Now, as I said, this doesn't always mean that you're going to kill them. It could mean that you challenge them and it didn't result in anyone dying. You could just go to the field of battle and fire your shots at the air and defend it, depending on the severity of the slight. If someone wants to destroy you, then they may take you all the way to the death, or vice versa. But generally, that's not what happened. Now, there were people who abused this system. The system was put into place in order for you to have recourse against somebody defaming you, but people abuse the system. People would become professional duelists or use it to bully people, in that they would use it as almost a business strategy. They would insult somebody or make a bad business deal and say, oh, well, you have a problem, well, duel me. But this was generally seen as, how should I put this? It wasn't allowed to just happen. I know of one case where a duelist goaded people into dueling him and killed them over and over again, and he was basically driven out of his state. Another person was tackled in the midst of dueling because they realized that he was just going to kill the other person for financial gain, basically, and threw him out of the state. So this wasn't allowed to continue. There were people who abused the system. There were even professional duelists, but it generally was not allowed to continue. Now, as I said, this is a tool in society to kind of keep social cohesion. It was a recourse for people to make sure that they were able to defend themselves, basically, in lieu of there being courts, which did not exist at the time. But it's important to note that this was only for the upper classes. You could only duel within your own class. If someone of a lower class challenged you to a duel, you could just ignore them. It was generally seen that you would duel people of your own class, but you would cane people of a lower class. In fact, there was, I'm drawing a blank now, but I believe it was a senator. He attacked somebody with a cane inside the State House, and people lose the context of that. What he was actually doing was saying, you're of a lower social class than me. He wasn't just he was beating the man with a cane, but he was also saying, you're of a lower social class than me, you don't belong here. It was a political statement. But you would only duel within your own class. There were duels carried out in lower classes, but this is when we get into whether or not something is a duel. A duel is a very specific thing. You had seconds. You had a very specific set of rules. You would agree on the rules beforehand. You would agree to meet somewhere. You would agree on the distance. Everything would be almost ritually carried out. If someone just goes into the street with Bowie knives and hacks at each other, that's not really a duel. There are many cases you see in history books or online or in movies where it's called a duel, and it's really just two people trying to kill each other. It's not what is considered an actual duel. An actual duel is between people of the same class. It has a set of rules. It is almost ritual. And it was meant as a social tool to uphold your honor. So the most important thing I hope you take away from this is that dueling was not a barbaric, bloody act. It was not meant for two people to stand in dueling grounds and kill each other or even wound each other. The point was that it was a social tool that was very necessary at the time and allowed people a recourse in case somebody attacked them, attacked their honor, which is a very real thing. It's not some lofty concept that we might consider today about being honorable. It was a very real, practical thing in those days that is almost like the credit rating of today's era. It meant whether or not people would do business with you, give you loans. Your life could be absolutely ruined if your honor was challenged. And it became an extremely important part of our history, of our culture, that has been basically forgotten nowadays and is almost looked down upon because people don't understand why it happened. They don't understand that there were no courts at that time that could handle this. There was no recourse for somebody who did not participate in dueling. So for the upper classes, where honor was everything, where mountains moved and fortunes were lost by the word of mouth, it was very important. And it's important that we understand things like this in history rather than just casting them aside with modern morality and our modern misunderstanding of historical context. So thank you for watching. Have a nice day.